two things were going on here. Jeffrey Epstein was a paedophile, and he was facilitating. He appears he was facilitating industrial scale sex trafficking that often came into contact with wealthy people. But he was also a node in a network of people that were exchanging very, very important information and influence, and all of those other things that go together. And I think it's quite important to separate the two of those things out. And I think the first part of it is, is incredibly important. And some of his power came from that. I think that's important to recognize as well. They're not totally distinct from each other. But in terms of like the kind of sexual abuse side, yes, this happens in other places. Yes, this happens in other contexts. But I think what's really important to not lose sight of in this is that that's happening. The sexual abuse of it is part of where he gets his power, but also where he gets his power and his influence is from being able to connect all these people together, for having preemptory and proprietary information, from being able to be the person who, for example, is able to get, as he was at the time, the business secretary, Peter Mandelson, emailing him, telling him details of an EU rescue facility that's going to be $500 billion in 2010 before they've come out. Like, this is incredibly important information. This is the kind of information that if we don't know, if Epstein passes that on to some people in the financial sector, they're going to be beholden to him, regardless of the sex trafficking. That's what's going to be a huge part of this. And I think that's the thing that is what you see, I think, is almost a moral black hole in the middle of this for all of those people. There's a kind of sense of people acting with complete impunity. There never seems to be a moment where someone puts up their hand and goes, "Should we be doing this, guys? Is this okay?" And this information, and I think that crosses across all of it. I think that's the bit that's really significant. I think it's not just about. I think it's really important to say that abuse, unfortunately, abuse almost always happens in closed environments, whether that's the Catholic Church, the Boy Scout movement, and in this way, we've got hermetically sealed environment of people who are almost too wealthy and too important to be touched. And one of the things I think that's striking, the slightly corollary comes out of this, and I've noticed this as I've gone through them, is the number of times the British legal establishment comes up as a thing that can be used. We can get British lawyers in to shut stuff down. And actually, interestingly, the Financial Times have been doing really good reporting on this. They've been across this really early and really putting in a lot of man hours into it. They had the story back in September about Jeffrey Epstein paying for Peter Mandelson's partner to do an osteopath course. They went to what was called sources close to Peter Mandelson, which we all know means either the person himself or really somebody like who's representing them. Putting this story to them, we're told is completely untrue, and we're threatened, said if you publish this, we'll sue you. We know that's true. It's true now. That story was there. That was 5 months ago, and this comes up in it. We see the names of top law firms. We see how stories are effectively, and how Epstein and others were able to silence stories by doing this. So I think what you're able to see with this is that's how the hermetically sealed box operates, and we only know any of this. This is so. What is also quite striking in all this. These are historic emails. Epstein died quite a long time ago. We actually only know this, ironically, because of political pressure that he probably wishes he'd never put to bear on it now from Donald Trump, who clearly has been implicated in all these now. But that's the politics of this that has actually forced these releases. Otherwise, we would have none of this immaterial.
Yeah, it definitely resonates what you were saying about the kind of sense that you get of impunity, that there's these emails are going back and forth, these messages that presumably, one imagines the senders thought that these emails would never see the light of day, and you sort of wonder how that could possibly be. But there is this sense that they thought, there's no problem here, or no one will ever know. So I want to come back to what you said earlier about kind of where we go forwards from here. You've talked about, the UK legal establishment, that there being kind of that sometimes being a kind of a block to this journalism that might bring some of this stuff to light. But is that kind of an avenue to pursue, to try and search for changes that can kind of lead to greater accountability? What could we do in Britain to make sure more of this stuff comes to light, and that we uncover, more of these stories and expose some of this potential corruption?
I think it's a really good question. I think the legal side of it's a really important one. There was a letter actually organised by the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition. SLAPP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, but effectively lawfare. So using the law to silence criticism, silence journalists. And there's a letter, I signed it, I think about 120 other editors signed it, that came out recently. The government has said they were going to do something on this. They haven't so far. It's a huge problem. This is, and it's not just involving the super. Like, it's not just involving household names like this. There's been lots of recent cases. I've experienced many slap suits myself, where people effectively sue you into silence. And it's easy. People go, look, if you're telling the truth, you've nothing to fear. You actually do, because it costs about £3 million to go to the High Court to fight one of these cases. And if someone sues you, you will have to go to the High Court. So if you don't have money, you cannot fight it, even if you're in the right. So that's a huge problem. I think that's one area where we definitely need to see some change. We also need to see something like today, as we're speaking, does this kind of pass the parcel of responsibility? Just talk about, as we mentioned, the Cabinet Office opening another inquiry. There's no clear sense of who's responsible for finding out. Like, did Peter Mandelson, is there misconduct in public office? This is a serious offence. It actually carries a potential life sentence. We don't see politicians ever threatened or ever tried for this very often. But we have here what looks like really potential prima facie evidence. Is the Crown Prosecution Service going to say something on this quickly? Are we going to start looking at this? Is there going to start becoming some sort of actual punishment for this sort of thing? Because that's where's the deterrent as it currently stands? Similarly, we've seen with the House of Lords, I think, is a story that needs to come out from this too. Peter Mandelson has resigned from Labour. He's still in the House of Lords. He was parachuted into the House of Lords years ago, around the same time he was exchanging a lot of these emails with Jeffrey Epstein. Again, that sense of being in the House of Lords is exactly the kind of reputational capital that someone like Epstein will thrive on. You go to America, he's a Lord. Here's Lord Mandelson. That stuff matters. That's important. I think we need to really, again, the government said, there's a lot of stuff that the Labour Party had said in opposition they were going to do something about, and frankly have done very little about. The Lords reform is another one of these things we've seen nothing on. I think that's a really big issue. And then in terms of kind of a bit more specific, the decision to appoint Mandelson as a UK ambassador is a really important, the US ambassador really is an important one. At Democracy for Sale, we've currently got the Information Commissioners investigating a complaint from us because to Freedom of Information request, because we wanted details of the vetting process and what Peter Mandelson, his declaration of interest, and they refused. They were not published, and we are still not getting that information. I think that is again shows a real problem with this whole system. And what we can see from this appointment is that, and what we can see from these emails, is that there isn't a world in which Peter Mandelson's business interest and his political interests are on either side. I think he would say there is, but I think there's a real sense in which we can't tell them apart from these emails. When he was appointed ambassador to the US, what due diligence was done about this, about his own business interests? How were those decisions made? I think there's a hell of a lot here about that goes to the heart, I think, of the British Constitution effectively. And I think it needs to. I think this is my one concern at the moment with this. Mandelson's a very important figure in all of this. So is Andrew. The victims are very important too. What Epstein did is very important. But actually, this shines a light, I think, on something that is actually much bigger than actually all of that.
I want to just ask you also quickly before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier this, the fact that the files are sort of out there, they're searchable, anybody can look at them. If you've been on social media this week, there are snippets of them everywhere. Yes, citizen journalists, but also just citizens, just people looking there and sharing stuff. And you're an investigative journalist. You spent years looking at these things. There's a journalists. There's a process in journalism of looking at stuff, of verifying, of checking. As you said, someone's name appearing in these files doesn't necessarily tell us anything. It really depends on what the file is. And there are some cases where Jeffrey Epstein was also trying to sending an email to make it look as if somebody was, somehow at his behest or something. He was very good at kind of working those connections. So how challenging is it to really make the most of these files for the good, as you've outlined, all these changes we need, when so many people are kind of picking over them and sharing them, this kind of mass frenzy over the files almost?
I think it's a real challenge. Like, on one level, I think it's really good that this information put in the public domain. It's worth actually starting with also prefacing some of that with the Trump administration has been the ones who've been redacting these. So in terms of, there's probably I think it's reasonable to ask, well, what have they redacted? So I think that's a very important question. This is not some neutral value play where everyone's just, here you go, the sunshine of transparency. This is not what's happened. So I think that's important. And as a journalist, one of the questions I will always ask is, like, where is this information coming from and whose interest is it? And so is it like, if you look at, say, big leaks, so journalists have often worked with big leaks, so the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and they're often like huge amounts of huge terabytes of data leaked by anonymously and given to a consortium of journalists who then go away and spend months cross-referencing, verifying, checking before publication. One of the challenges, I think, with this is exactly that. This is all coming out as a flow. And I think trying to, like, as a journalist, I think that's a big, really important part of this. Like, your job is to figure out what's, is to stand stuff up, is to say, where's this other sourcing for this? Where can I see that this is legitimate? And to go to the people involved and ask them, what did this happen? And I think there is a bit of a danger with this. Also within this, as I mentioned, there's a lot of correspondence to the FBI from members of the public who are making lurid claims that are not necessarily corroborated by anything in this. So that's getting all mixed together as well as part of the problem. So it's about separate. You have to separate all of that out. You have to look at what's happening. I think that is, in one level, I'm a big believer in transparency and accountability, and I really like something like the Panama Papers. You can now search. They would also, after the investigation came out, they're now public. From the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, but that will also say just by being named in the papers doesn't actually mean anything. Similarly with this, I think it's a real challenge, and it's also showing some of the difficulties, I think, of the current media landscape, which is a different conversation, but it does show the challenges of, like, kind of verifying information before you put it into the public domain.
One of the things that's kind of struck me on that note is that I wonder whether it will make it more difficult for us to, as a society, come to a collective understanding about what really is true within those releases and what isn't, because so much of this information, as you say, some of it's true, some of it are like lurid tips. It's just out there and it's already lodged in people's brains and, is shaping how we understand what has happened. And I just feel like that's something different maybe with this release of information compared to those previous kind of the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, and I worry about the consequences of that.
Yeah, I think it's very different. I think, like, on the Panama Paper, they're quite complicated financial information. It was to do with corporate documents. Often it was to do with people you didn't really know. These are much more high-profile people. It was trickier to really figure out exactly what they were doing. This gives you a kind of insight into, like, into a way of working, into an elite structure, into the power structures that you just didn't really get from those. And I think there's some, like, my big fear in some ways with this is that it just exists as this kind of rolling internet social media thing. Some stories that are very selective, and because they're the ones that you can really pin down, become mainstream media stories, get talked about. We talked about them and others. And what you end up with is this sense that there's some, like, shadowy elite that run the world and no engagement really happens. And I do worry about that. I think there's a real danger with this, that becomes the outworking. And part of it is because, like, and I think it is also the people involved need to be accountable for what their involvement was. And it is striking how many people have already started to resign from various aspects of public life on the back of this. And so that tells part of its own story. But the challenge, I think, will be and I think there's a real challenge to large media organizations now in terms of how to actually animate this and narrate this in a way that doesn't just add, that brings more light rather than heat.
Yeah. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through some of that. And we'll follow your further work on this with interest. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, guys.
You've been watching an interview from the Prospect podcast. To listen to this episode in full, click the link in the description below. And to read or listen to more of Prospect's journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.